Back on the YouTube channel, taking your questions. This has proven to be a fairly popular segment, so we're going to keep it going. I've got a lot of good feedback on the first couple of Q&As that I've done exclusively on YouTube, and this is a YouTube exclusive. Quick reminder before I get into your Q&A that the Brian J Matos Podcast will be back with new episodes in the formal podcast series in a couple of weeks. We've got some great interviews lined up. I've given you a preview of some of the things we're going to talk about in Season 3. Go back to my Matos Musings, the very first one. It's a Season 3 preview, so you get a sense of the topics we're going to cover. Can't guarantee you what order we're going to cover them in. Of course, it depends on the availability of our guests. But we do spend a lot of time trying to find just the right people to talk about these topics and issues to make it worth your time. So even if we go a little out of order in what I talked about in that Season 3 preview, just know we're going to get to all those topics, and we'll take our time and make sure we have the right guests and do that thoughtfully. But before we get back to those episodes, let's continue with our Q&A series. And again, this is a YouTube exclusive, so subscribe. If you're finding us for the first time on YouTube, you can subscribe to this channel and not only be the first to be alerted when we do these weekly Q&As, but you will also be the first to know when our episodes post. You can follow us anywhere that you get your podcasts, but right here on the YouTube channel, we do post full episodes, and you can subscribe to this channel as well as you can on any other podcast platform. Okay, so let's get to Q&A for this week. Really thoughtful stuff, by the way. I did have to spend some time really thinking about my answers. So here we go. The first is from Sam in Denmark. Sam asks, which emerging regions or economies do you believe are most undervalued or overlooked in mainstream global discourse? And what indicators are you watching most closely there? This is a great question, and I am not the expert, certainly, in global economics. That's why I bring on guests to talk about it. But for me, as a curious mind who does consume a lot of international coverage, there's no question about which region of the world that I feel like I'm often starved for content from in terms of its meaning to the international community. And I would say that's the entire continent of Africa. So when you ask, in terms of an emerging region, why do I think it's undervalued and overlooked? The economies are not enormous. Certainly the populations are big, but the GDP of many of the sub-Saharan African nations is not as big as the European countries, the East Asian countries, even the Southeast Asian countries. Certainly pales in comparison to anything in North America. But there's a reason why international players, big international players from Russia and China to the United States and European countries for generations have sought either economic dominance or economic partnership. Unfortunately, there was obviously an era of colonialism with direct control and some abuses in that part of the world. But there's a reason why every empire that has ever been has an interest in the continent. It's obviously mineral rich. There's a ton of human potential. Just think about how many young people there are in an aging world with so many advanced economies, with populations that are aging very quickly, that are getting past their peak working years. And I feel like Africa is the opposite. As a continent, it is a continent full of young, hardworking, enthusiastic, entrepreneurial people who are surrounded by tremendous natural resources and wealth, but are obviously vexed by significant challenges, whether it's governmental challenges, whether it's public policy challenges, whether it's environmental challenges. So it's both an extremely challenging environment, but an extremely promising one. And I would love to see a lot more coverage. And by the way, there has been a lot more attention paid to the region by the big international geopolitical powers in the world, including the United States. We can spend time in future episodes talking about some of the specifics of that. But towards the end of the Biden administration, there were some very specific projects that the Biden White House was pushing in particularly sub-Saharan Africa to ensure the United States has a role to play in the future of infrastructure development around energy resources, rare earth minerals, a whole variety of other extraction-oriented economies. But the goal there seemed to be both to ensure the U.S. has a stake in that development, but also to make sure that countries like China, Russia, and even the Europeans, they don't entrench themselves in a way that disintermediates the U.S. So it's an area to continue to watch. If you asked me, is there a specific country? Is there a specific region? Is there a specific territory? Africa is a big, complicated place. And so the dynamics of East and West Africa and South African nations and Central African nations are all very, very different. But I expect to see a lot more focus on this part of the world in general. I do think it's tremendously undervalued and overlooked. And if I had to pick another place that might be in the second tier, I would say South Asia in general, but I'll focus on India just as a country. When I think about how many people live in India, again, how much youth there is, how much entrepreneurship there is, how much potential there is in the big cities, in the small cities, in the rural areas. It is a rapidly developing economy. It's a rapidly developing part of the world. Again, vexed by all the challenges that any other developing country may have. But I think there's a lot of flexibility in their system, especially in a system that has such a robust heritage and history of democracy, where challenges can be worked out at the ballot box and not necessarily through violent upheavals or through rebellions and so forth. I think that there is a straight trajectory towards prosperity. It's going to be tough. It's going to be challenging. I think we hear a little more about it now in the United States than we've heard in the past. There's a larger Indian population in the U.S. hungry for news from India, so that helps. But generally speaking, as you think about the reordering of international trade relationships, whether it's the Americans, the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians, anybody who's looking to diversify away from China or from some of the countries of Southeast Asia, India is such an obvious choice for that, for all the reasons we talked about. So those are the two. Just as a curious guy who asks questions around the world, these are the two places that I think are really undervalued and overlooked, and I'd love to see a lot more robust coverage of both. All right, next question comes from Jason in Orlando, Florida. Jason asks, how do you separate signal from noise in a 24/7 media environment, especially when narratives are shaped by national interests, corporate agendas, and algorithmic bias? Jason, thank you for the question. It is the main objective of this show, is to find the signal in the noise. We are specifically not oriented towards a 24/7 media cycle. It's why we don't post on a daily basis. We are not interested in advancing or combating narratives per se. We are not looking to advance or push back against a corporate agenda or a national interest. We want to think about the bigger trends, the bigger topics, the bigger geopolitical issues, the economic issues in the world. So when you ask, how do I separate the two, the most important thing that I can counsel, if you like the kind of subjects that I pick on this show, is to just ask a lot of questions in your everyday life with your everyday relationships. Turn off the television, step away from social media. You can always use it as a way to source ideas, but start asking around. People, especially people who don't consume a tremendous amount of news or really don't seek out news. If you talk to those folks and ask what's top of mind for them, you will be able to draw threads between what you're hearing from people that don't spend a lot of time in the news and then what you're seeing in some of the news stories and some of the studies, and even in your own life. Just pay attention to the trends that you spend more and more brain power on. So the best way to do this is to compare what you see and hear in your news consumption to what you see and hear in your everyday life, and to keep a normal group of family, friends who are specifically not newsies. In other words, folks who don't listen to this show on a regular basis. The kind of people who are much more interested in focusing on raising their kids, and they're focused on their personal business and the one niche that they're in, or, they're members of the community who really focus on their faith, or they focus on, the development of their, community, their homes, their churches, their schools. They don't bother themselves with all of the big issues of the world. Where you start to hear the overlap between what those two communities hear, that's often where you're going to find those signals. So I'll give you a good example. I had an episode, this was 2 years ago now in this series, where it was just me talking about insurance. That's it. I just saw this as a trend, and I had read a lot of stories and a lot of studies about rising insurance premiums and insurance companies pulling out of parts of the world, and certainly parts of the United States. And in my personal life, I had so many people who were noticing their increasing insurance premiums, business insurance, homeowners insurance, car insurance, health insurance. And so I started to connect the dots there that there's something happening at the macro level and people are feeling it in the micro level. And the people feeling it are not reading the stories and being told. They're experiencing it. They're noticing it. So that was a good signal and indication for me that there's something going on here that goes beyond hype or goes beyond an agenda. This is real. This is happening. Another good example of this, I've had several guests on talking about demographic trends. And a lot of this is what I've heard from folks who either run businesses or they're in senior leadership positions where they've struggled with the generational challenges of a workforce that includes everybody from baby boomers and a few members even of the greatest generation are still at the tail ends of their careers, all the way down to the newest college grads that are part of a digital generation. And so as I heard the challenges that they had, it inspired me to look a little deeper and ask more questions about this generational divide. And it was the inspiration for several shows. Now, there's tons of academic conversation on this. There's plenty of news coverage about demographics. But what makes it a relevant topic for this show is those people who don't read any of that, but are experiencing it and feeling it and seeing it in their everyday life. And how do we tie that together and make sure that we have a conversation here about where we think that's going and what that means as we run our businesses and, frankly, as you raise your families and as you think about the future of your countries and the international community as a whole. So I hope that's a helpful answer for those who are curious how my mind works, how I pick topics for this show, how I think about who I want to talk to. So these are great questions. Thank you again, Sam, Jason. Keep them coming. My email address is info@brianjmatos.com. You can find me on any of your favorite social media platforms. Feel free to direct message me on any of them. And you can always leave comments on this YouTube channel, and I will read all of them. I'll respond to as many as I can. And I appreciate you all listening. Thank you for continuing to bring your questions. We'll answer them on this YouTube channel exclusively. And stay tuned. We have new full hour-long episodes of the Brian J Matos Podcast interview series coming very soon. We'll be previewing those in some of these Q&A sessions as we record them and get them ready for publication. If you have family or friends who would be interested in some of what we talk about here, would love to hear from them as well. So subscribe to this YouTube channel, recommend it to others, and you can find me anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Talk again soon.